Wow, that penalty that Fernando Alonso got, eh? Well, it's lasted more than 20 seconds, that's for sure. In fact, it's been going on for so long, it's putting Bottas's Monaco tyre to shame. It's hard to imagine that the incident between George Russell and Fernando Alonso happened only 2 weeks ago. But with the amount of headlines that it's generated since then, you almost get the impression that it's almost as egregious as the situation we saw with Hamilton and Verstappen at Silverstone, and then again at Monza. What was really going down between George Russell and Fernando Alonso at Turn 6 in Melbourne, which resulted in George Russell in the barrier, then being pinballed back into the track, and then almost being collided with by Lance Stroll, and Fernando Alonso escaping all of that? Well, until the stewards got a hold of him and went, "You're nicked, sunshine." Was it a deliberate move to throw the Mercedes off the track completely? No, of course it wasn't. I doubt that Alonso would want Russell to crash out and end up stricken on the circuit fearing for his life. They respect the pants off of one another. Fernando wouldn't do that. He's a crafty, mischievous little individual, but I don't think he would ever go to those lengths, especially when you go back and watch that clip when George Russell is in the car and he is genuinely fearing for his life, desperately calling out for a red flag because he cannot see anything that's going on the track. All he can see is basically the barrier and sky. And he can't even get out of properly because he's at a 45-degree angle. I would be terrified if I were in that position. And more people are starting to think that way, that George was genuinely scared. Not that he was trying to come up with a way of going, "Right, blimey chaps, red flag because I want to save points." Or then people going, "Oh, look at him, yet another last lap mistake. Oh, George is terrible." Yeah, you don't really hear that anymore. More people are actually going, "Damn, he could have been killed." Woof. But I think this has gone beyond that, an incident between two cars. This is something that is a response to what happened last year between Alonso and Hamilton, and also things that weren't really responded to in a prompt manner to do with the Albert Park circuit itself. And Alonso just happened to be caught in the middle of it. Everybody's had an opinion on it, including myself in the Australian Grand Prix winners and losers video, where at the time, I thought it was a relatively fair decision that, yes, Alonso should have gotten a 20-second penalty. But every single time I look back at it and I look at it in more detail, I am happy to hold my hand up and say, no, that was probably a little bit too hasty on my part. And instead, at most, it should have been a 10-second penalty, which is something that the drivers have been requesting. In the eyes of many, a 5-second penalty doesn't really mean all that much. I mean, you hear that from the commentators themselves, that, oh, you get a 5-second penalty, and everyone's like, oh, okay, manage the gap, or drive a little bit quicker to get under 5 seconds. It's easily manageable. 10 seconds, not so much. And if George hadn't been sent into the barrier and he just had a little wobble but kept it on the track, then there shouldn't have been a penalty at all. At worst, there should have just been a little rap of the knuckles and said, "Mando, you naughty boy." I wouldn't be here talking to you today. We would have all just seen this as yet another example of Fernando Alonso being a cheeky chappy and a bit of a scamp. A mischievous one at that, with a very perfect jawline. But what's become clear, regardless of the penalty bestowed on Alonso, is that Turn 6 of Albert Park needs a bit of a tweak. In fact, that's exactly what's been discussed for seemingly quite a while now with many of the drivers, and something brought up on Thursday of this week before the Japanese Grand Prix of Oscar Piastri. Him saying that that area of the circuit really does need a look at, and it is something that is going to be considered by the governing body and the track organisers. I mean, it makes sense, since the entry speed is a lot faster now, and then you're going to be reaching even higher speeds on that back straight. I just feel that the beginnings of that corner are a little bit antiquated, that they weren't modified accordingly when the circuit was updated in 2022. We've now had 3 major shunts in 2 years, and also it's been an example of why tethering wheels to the car, so that means they don't go flying off and going into the crowd or anything like that, is not necessarily the best option. Okay, the wheel doesn't go off and cause any problems elsewhere on the circuit, but then it results in the car being somewhat tipped over slightly, meaning that George's exit of the car is compromised. Had George been flat on the ground, he would have been able to see cars coming, or he might have been able to properly get out of the car and then run to the barrier, so that means he could escape potential injury. He was just a sitting duck. He had no idea what was going on. Just in case you're not quite sure what the stewards said, I'll go into it a little bit more detail, thanks to the likes of F1 DocSpot on Twitter, which provides all of these press releases from the stewards a few minutes early than some of the official news sites provide you. It means that you are on the cusp of F1 news before the big journalists are. So I'll save you a long-winded explanation as to why Fernando was penalised. despite them confirming he was within his right to tweak his racing line, and that he couldn't control the dirty air behind him which destabilised the Mercedes. So there are two factors there that weren't really the point of contention. And oh yes, it was down to the supposed brake test that Alonso had administered against Russell. Brake 100 metres earlier than had been expected, and particularly the previous lap, which then sent George Russell into a little bit of a spiral, and that resulted in him getting a little bit of a wobble, the dirty air affecting his car, which meant that he went off into the barriers at a relatively high speed, and then of course he hit the barrier, he pinged off of the barrier, and then he ended up on the track. And then Alonso stepped on the accelerator after braking, but then claims have said that he was dealing with a throttle issue as said on the radio, and on the car audio what sounds like a sticky throttle. But then you hear the likes of Nico Hülkenberg being all Sherlock Holmes, saying that, oh, he wasn't mentioning that throttle issue later on, he said it was just down to standard procedures, that things didn't add up. Well, if Nico Hülkenberg decides to retire from Formula 1, he could get a job as a private investigator. Enter Sherlock Hulks. In any case, it was considered potentially dangerous driving, and instead of the driver requested 10-second penalty for such transgressions, there were aggravating circumstances taken into account here, which upgraded that to a drive-through penalty, or 20 seconds added to his overall time, since Alonso deliberately slowed down, and then accelerated, which sent George into the gravel due to the surprise move and the dirty air behind the Aston Martin. Aggravated? No, George doesn't get aggravated, he just gets a bit miffed. We should know that by now. Then you had the blowback from the Aston Martin fans saying that it was completely unfair and that Alonso should not have been penalised because he didn't make contact with George Russell. George Russell went off the track on his own. And then they were even more upset with the fact that Aston Martin didn't appeal the decision. They accepted it. And then that led to the point where Mike Crack had to put out their own letter, similar to what Toto Wolff did in Bahrain in 2023, a letter in response to the fans, explaining what happened and why, yes, they are aggrieved with a 20-second penalty, and they are backing their driver 100%, but the reason why they didn't protest that decision is because, put simply, they really had no legs to stand on. There was no extra bit of evidence that could prove Fernando Alonso is innocent, and in the wake of that, it would have been relatively pointless to have mounted a right to appeal. Especially after all of the hijinks that Haas put in last year, where they left it until the very last minute, a couple of weeks later after Austin, to then mount an appeal regarding track limits and Checo, which was ultimately then just thrown out because, you know, they were really cheeky about it. And now you have to get your appeal in within 96 hours or so, but much quicker than before, where it was weeks. And on top of that, there is a very real danger that if a brand new set of stewards or a brand new set of eyes looks at that footage and then thinks, 20 seconds? That's too lenient. Maybe more. Because it has happened in the past where a team and driver has appealed a decision that happened on the track, it then goes to the Court of Appeal, and sometimes the appeal is not just upheld, but it's increased. I note your attention back to 1994, the Brazilian Grand Prix, where Eddie Irvine clashed with the likes of Jos Verstappen, which then took out multiple cars at turn 4, and then Eddie Irvine was issued at the time a $10,000 fine and a one-race ban. Naturally, the Eddies were really unhappy with this decision, so they appealed it, and they thought that they had a case that they would have been able to overturn the result. Well, they overturned the fine, so Eddie Irvine didn't have to pay anything, or the team, but instead of them getting a one-race ban, that was increased to 3. The stewards reckoning that Irvine had driven recklessly and that the overall collision could have easily been avoided going into turn 4. That easily could have happened with Aston Martin and Fernando. They could have looked at that and maybe given them even more penalty points, or an even longer time penalty, or maybe a complete race ban if they got somebody on a really bad day. So, without any further evidence to really prove their innocence or try and change the overall outlook, then it would have been utterly pointless. And when you look at the results, Aston Martin weren't affected all that much. In fact, they benefited from George Russell getting a DNF because with Fernando's penalty and he got sent down the order, Lance Stroll got promoted. He got a 6th place. And that's resulted in Mercedes and Aston Martin being level pegging right now, and there being a little bit of a competition there instead of Aston Martin, probably most likely this year, being in no man's land in 5th. So I can understand in a way why Aston Martin didn't appeal it, but they certainly weren't happy about it. But I think the situation's gone far beyond what Fernando Alonso did or didn't do. It's become a bone of contention amongst drivers, track organisers, and the way that junior drivers may view this. Well, at least that's how George Russell views this, because he's the head of the Grand Prix Drivers Association he feels a natural responsibility to be a role model for young drivers, since, he's at the top of the food chain in regards to the drivers and how they work with Formula One. Russell thinks that the punishment was justified, as that it may open up a can of worms had it not been contested. Younger drivers may look at that situation and go, oh, I can brake on the straight? Okay then, Alonso did it and he's the most experienced driver in Formula One, therefore I can do it, and it works. And then we might have had incidents, and then, Fernando Alonso might have ended up with egg on his face. Or would he though? Because Fernando, in response to all of this, said, I'm not changing anything, deal with it. If this had happened at a different corner or at a different circuit, then the outcome may or may have not been the same. George Russell might not have gone off. George Russell might not have crashed in that way. And then maybe it would have been left completely forgotten as a little bit of a cheeky move. We would have had a situation where George Russell was just blustering feathers out of his mouth or sweating into his visor about Fernando, and then that would have been that. At worst, the stewards may have taken a look at it quickly, noted it, or maybe, as I said earlier, given Fernando a little bit of a rap on the knuckles, and that would have been that. Alonso does have a good point here, because something similar to this did happen in Abu Dhabi 2023. When he had that situation with Lewis Hamilton, he did a brake test according to Hamilton, but all of that was to do with DRS. As we saw with Verstappen and Hamilton at Saudi Arabia in 2021, it was all a sense of mind games, and it wasn't a sense of Alonso being reckless or dangerous or anything like that. No, at the time, Alonso's driving was just branded as mischievous, and the stewards back then did not give him a penalty. But at the same time, it did spark some debate amongst the fans, especially since it was the final race of the season, and we wouldn't have had much else to talk about for the next few months. But I really am starting to get the feeling that because this got a little bit of negative headlines, and then the stewards take a look at this and go, oh, that's similar to what happened in Abu Dhabi. Oh, maybe we should not let this slide anymore. And then, of course, George Russell crashes out and then leaves himself vulnerable on the track. Then you can't leave this unpunished. So therefore, Alonso was at fault here. And therefore, they bring their very, very, very long-winded and very, very conversational discussion in the official documents saying that Alonso should have been penalized 20 seconds. I think Alonso is the fall guy here because, in reality, the people that should be responsible here are the people who are responsible for organising the track and taking care of it, as well as the governing body for not looking into turn 6, not looking back through all of the years when there have been incidents there and going, that barrier, those cars end up back on the track. Maybe we should have done something about this because, I don't need to tell you about all of the stuff and barriers and Spa and all that stuff. Yeah, Melbourne's sort of really been not thinking about that, especially with that brand new section where it's much faster, and therefore you are going to get a little bit more of a dangerous collection of accidents. But hey, better than never. They are looking into this, and options that are being considered are including the likes of asphalt runoffs to that corner, so that means drivers can make a quick escape, or maybe have some high grip tarmac like at Paul Ricard, which was a good idea, but it really hurt your eyes, where the cars would be brought to a screeching halt much sooner, and therefore they're not going to be going back onto the track. Or simply, and this is what most of the drivers are hoping for, they just adjust the angle of the barriers slightly, so that means instead of it acting like a pinball machine, they just stop the car, like barriers are supposed to. Then there was George Russell on the radio frantically begging for a red flag, quite rightly so, because of course he was scared. And then the stewards and the organisers not doing that, and instead they issued a virtual safety car, which in a way I sort of get, because they were effectively the same thing. If you issue a red flag, it's not just suddenly going to cause the cars to go, right, stop exactly where you are. No, it's just going to neutralise the race. The cars have to go back to the pits at a snail's pace, and therefore they would have been at a slower delta just like they are under a VSC. George Russell has an idea about maybe these flags could be issued immediately, so that means if something goes down on the track which is suspicious, then a red flag could be automatically engaged without the need of any humans getting in the way. Which is sort of logical, but I can easily see plenty of mistakes with that. We might end up with a false positive, where there might be an incident where a car just goes slightly wide, kicks up a puff of smoke or some dirt, and then the cameras see it and go, oh my god, red flag! Red flag! We would all be cross. But this proves my point that I think the stewards here were really overreacting and responding to negative criticisms from what happened in 2023. Not just the Alonso-Hamilton thing, but also the red flag that happened a couple of laps before the end of Melbourne last year, and then all the chaos that happened at turn 1, it was all utter bedlam. We as fans loved it, but I'm pretty sure the people who were responsible in looking after the cars probably were bricking it. And I feel like if it had been red flagged, it might have been even worse. We could have easily had a one-lap dash similar to Baku in 2021, where Lewis got his braking maps wrong, and therefore he went careening into turn 1 instead of going around turn 1. Maybe some people with fresher tyres and some slight repairs to their car could have easily tried to challenge people for the win. Then I think it could have been even more of a desperate tactic. We could have had something even worse than Melbourne 2023. And as we've seen over the years, turn 1 at Melbourne does yield some very exciting results. And also I can see from an administrative point of view, if they had red flagged the situation just to then resume it for one lap, it probably would have been very inconvenient for the fans there. There would have been a lot of waiting around as they cleared everything up, because it did cause a lot of damage and it did cause a lot of debris to be chucked onto the track. It would have been a lot of time for preparation just for maybe 3 minutes of action on track at most. Now, speaking of turn 1, Lando Norris has come to the defense of Fernando Alonso, sort of, regarding that situation, saying that George should really have anticipated the move coming after racing with Fernando for a long time and being a fan of his work, and that more attention should be given to turn 1 situations where, quite rightly, they're not braking at the usual place that you would usually brake for turn 1, and that there are 20 cars going into that one bend. As Norris puts it, nobody's quite sure exactly when the driver ahead of you is going to brake, or the person to the side of you. It can easily be disorientating, and therefore, as soon as you see somebody brake, you brake, and then it causes that concertina effect. As we saw at Bahrain at the beginning of this year, we saw multiple cars getting into an argy-bargy, and then many races were compromised. But he is right in the sense that George Russell should have been aware about what Fernando Alonso is capable of, but in the case of turn 6, he was simply not aware of it. And then he probably wasn't aware of the results of dirty air, which Aston Martin is quite good at, because remember in 2022, when all the talk was about the lack of dirty air, then they bring a rear wing upgrade, which causes dirty air, which means if you get stuck behind an Aston Martin, you are not going to go anywhere. But all of this brings into the context the placement of cars, and Hulkenberg does continue on this and elaborates further. He brings up that he wasn't impressed with Fernando's chicanery, and that he should have been aware of the configuration of Melbourne as a semi-street circuit, and that moves like his would yield a nasty result. But he too reiterates that turn 6 needs to be looked at, as in his opinion, it's the wrong speed range, the wrong corner, and also the gear shift or the change deceleration was quite a big delta, obviously. Which is just making me think more and more and more that this penalty aimed at Fernando was quite unfair. And that, again, at most, it should have been a 10-second penalty. At most. But realistically, it should have just been a reprimand. Especially since there was no contact between the cars, and that also, there have been discussions amongst the drivers for something to be done at turn 6, and then nothing was done until you've now got George Russell, who's had now the most blatant example of why there needs to be change there, because if you get a situation where a car is tipped on its side and the driver can't get out and there's a car behind them, then it could easily lead to a terrible and terrifying accident. It's such a good thing that the virtual safety car was called when it did, and that Lance Stroll was warned many seconds in advance. That means he didn't go careening into that and then damaging himself, and potentially George Russell could have been killed. The track organisers need to take this seriously, since Albon had a similar situation, because he went off at turn 6 and then went back onto the track. And since George is the head of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, and he thusly represents the drivers in terms of the courts and in inquiries, he should really be using his weight and muscle to talk to the track organisers and get his input taken seriously, so that maybe instead of changing the corner characteristics, which he thinks would be a shame because he thinks the corner is amazing, instead just look to the barrier and change the angle of it. So that means the cars, if they go into it, they either stay in the barrier or they get pinged further into the gravel trap, which means, yeah, it's a little bit harder to escape from, but at least you're nowhere near the circuit and you're out of harm's way. But I think that Fernando Alonso in this situation is right, that it all comes down to context. Where this happens, what corner and what circuit. The punishment to me feels more and more like it's some sort of reactive response to the fact that Alonso didn't get a penalty last year, and then there was some criticism there, and then something similar with Alonso happened again, also involving a Mercedes, and the stewards then have to go, oh, we have to be seen to be doing something, and that it was an overreaction in the sense that George Russell ended up back on the track. And that was mainly a fault in the track's design rather than what Fernando Alonso did. And even in a way, Russell says for the most part, Alonso had every right to defend his position. But also at the same time, you just feel like George Russell's giving mixed messages here, but I'm also glad that he's safe and that he's okay. But really, the buck needs to stop with the Melbourne Albert Park organisers. They need to look at what happened at turn 6 and the fact that as the cars get faster and faster, we may see more of this happening, and I wouldn't be surprised if things don't change that next year we might get a similar incident. Hopefully with not Alex Albon damaging another chassis, and now Logan has to ride with that damaged chassis in Suzuka for no fault of his own, changes need to be made at the circuit, because Fernando Alonso is not going to change the way he drives, which in a way is good because we find him entertaining and interesting, and that George Russell should have, in a way, seen it coming. But in a way, Aston Martin aren't hurting too badly, but we still got a fight for 4th place in the Constructors on our hands. The people that really should be punished or reprimanded are the people who decided that Turn 6 didn't really need all that much change, considering now that that part of the circuit is much faster. To me, this was just Fernando playing a pro-gamer move, and as we all know, Fernando is no stranger to pro-gamer moves, like he is doing with Mercedes, putting himself firmly in the picture, even if he doesn't have any intentions of leaving Aston Martin. He likes to be considered by the likes of Toto. Something I discuss more of in this video here, you can go and watch right now, and trust me, Fernando, oh, he's a sneaky Pete. Sneaky Pete.